Have you ever driven through a town where the streets were empty, the curtains twitched, and every instinct screamed at you to keep moving? We're diving into 5 true small-town horror stories set in creepy, isolated communities, abandoned farmlands, and rural backroads where outsiders are definitely not welcome. These aren't just ghost stories. They're accounts of real people who took a wrong turn and found themselves in places where the welcome mat was soaked in something darker. Before we go down these county roads, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't get left behind in the next town with no signal. Now lock your doors, ignore the waving hands in the fields, and let's drive into the heart of nowhere. Audrey Kinlaw, a 24-year-old traveling nurse from Asheville, North Carolina, had just finished a grueling 3-month contract in a rural hospital and decided to take the scenic route home through the Blue Ridge foothills. Her little Honda packed with snacks and a brand new GPS that kept losing signal as the roads narrowed from paved 2 lanes to gravel tracks. And it was around dusk when she passed a hand-painted sign that read, "Nebo Landing welcomes you, population. 81 home of the eternal harvest." The letters dripping with fresh red paint that looked disturbingly like it hadn't dried yet. And because her gas tank was bumping empty, she figured she'd stop at the only light she could see. A flickering gas station where a man in overalls pumped her fuel without saying a word, his face hidden under a wide straw hat. And when she tried to pay with a card, he shook his head slowly and said, "No charge for travelers on feast night. You're just in time. Head down to the barn at the end of Main Street. They're expecting you." And she felt a cold prickle on her neck because she had never told anyone she was coming, and the word expecting settled into her stomach like a stone. But the town was weirdly beautiful in a haunting way. Neat white houses with dark windows. A white steepled church with a bell that tolled even though no wind blew. In a general store with a sign advertising fresh cider, locally grown, come in and stay. And when she pulled up to the barn at the end of the street, she saw the whole town had gathered. 80 or so people in old-fashioned clothes, the women in long gingham dresses, and the men in stiff collars. And they all turned to look at her car with identical smiles, identical tilts of their heads. And a tall man with a face that was too smooth for his gray hair walked up to her window and said, "Welcome, traveler. We've set a place for you at the table. You'll be the guest of honor at the harvest supper." And Audrey, her nurse's instinct now screaming, noticed that none of them were blinking. Not a single person in that crowd had blinked since she arrived. And she noticed that the long table set up inside the barn was piled with food. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a huge golden turkey. And at the center was an empty chair with a wreath of dried corn husks draped over the back. And the tall man, whose name she later learned was Elder Finch, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "The harvest has been bountiful, but we need a witness. Someone from outside, to see what the land has given us. Then you'll be free to go." And she'll let herself be guided to the table because the alternative, running back to her car with 80 bodies between her and escape, seemed impossible. And she sat in the empty chair and the townspeople began to eat, passing platters with mechanical precision, and at first the food was normal, delicious even. But then a woman with a tight gray bun leaned over and whispered, "You're eating the memory of the last guest." He was a salesman from Knoxville, very stringy, but the heart was tender. And Audrey looked down at her plate, and the slice of turkey was no longer turkey, but something pink and glistening, a slab of meat that twitched slightly. And the cider in her cup was thick and salty. And the entire table fell silent as Elder Finch stood and raised his glass and said to Audrey, "Who will nourish us, body and soul, and to the next harvest which comes when the soil is thirsty again, and Audrey lurched to her feet, now knocking over the bench, and ran through the barn doors into a night that had gone pitch black. No stars, no moon, just the sound of 80 pairs of feet shuffling behind her at a steady, unhurried pace. And she dove into her Honda, and the engine turned over by some miracle, and she sped out of Nebo, landing with the headlights cutting a tunnel through the dark, and in her rearview mirror she saw the entire town standing in the road, their smiles still fixed, their hands raised in a wave that was not a goodbye but a promise. And when she reached the nearest real town 40 miles away, she was shaking so hard the sheriff had to pry her from the steering wheel. And he told her Nebo Landing had been abandoned since a mudslide in 1953. There was no town there anymore, just a few rotted foundations and a barn that the county had burned down decades ago. But Audrey knows what she saw, and she still can't eat meat without feeling it pulse on her tongue. And sometimes when she's driving at dusk, she catches a whiff of fresh cider and hears Elder Finch's voice on the wind, still waiting for her to return and finish her supper. Connor Beaudry, a 29-year-old land surveyor from Bozeman, Montana, got dispatched to a remote parcel of farmland in the northeastern corner of the state to update boundary lines for a bank foreclosure, a property that hadn't been lived on in decades according to the county records. And he drove his pickup down a rutted dirt track through fields of dry, rattling wheat until he came to a farmhouse that sat hunched in the middle of a vast, flat expanse. A 2-story clapboard structure with a sagging porch and windows that were all shuttered from the inside. And the first thing he noticed was that there was no front door, just a smooth expanse of weathered wood where the door should have been, as if the house had grown skin over the wound. And he circled the entire structure twice and found no door at all, no back entrance, no cellar hatch. Just blank walls and those dark, shuttered windows. And the second thing he noticed was the sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that came from inside the house, like a heartbeat amplified, like a drum made of meat. And he pressed his ear to the wall, and the thumping quickened, as if whatever was inside knew he was there and was getting excited, and his surveyor's logic told him to mark the coordinates and leave. But his curiosity, that fatal human itch, made him pry open one of the shutters with a crowbar. And inside he saw a single large room that should not have been there, because the house was supposed to be partitioned into a kitchen, parlor, and bedrooms. But all the interior walls had been torn out, leaving one cavernous space lit by a single bare bulb dangling from a long cord. And in the center of that room was a massive wooden table, and on the table lay a figure, a man, or what used to be a man, his body splayed open and hollowed out like a canoe, but still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, wet gasps. And standing around the table were 3 figures in long black coats and wide-brimmed hats, their faces obscured by waxed canvas masks. And they were slowly, methodically knitting the man's skin back together with long bone needles and thick black thread. But they weren't sewing him shut. They were attaching something to him, something that squirmed and wriggled, a pale, grub-like thing that let out a high, keening cry like a baby. And as Connor watched in frozen horror, one of the figures looked up, its mask turning directly toward the window. It raised a single finger as if to say, "Wait your turn," and Connor fell backward off the porch, scrambled to his truck, and gunned the engine. But as he tore down the dirt track, he saw in his rearview mirror that the farmhouse now had a door, a fresh, raw-looking door that hadn't been there before, and it was swinging slowly open, and a thin sliver of yellow light spilled out. And silhouetted in that light was a shape that was too tall, too thin, its arms hanging down to its knees. And it raised one long-fingered hand and waved at him. Not a threatening wave, but a neighborly one. A come-back-soon wave, and Connor reported the property as inaccessible and quit his job the next week. But he knows now that the door appeared because the farmhouse had decided he was invited. And sometimes at night he feels a tug at the center of his chest, a thread being pulled from very far away, and he has to press his hand to his sternum to make sure his skin is still his own. Leticia Fuentes, a 34-year-old long-haul trucker out of Laredo, Texas, knew every trick of the road, from fake way stations to lot lizards to the stretches of highway where your CB radio picks up voices speaking in languages that don't exist. But nothing prepared her for the gas station outside a tiny speck of a town called Gideon's Hollow in the Missouri Ozarks. A place she stopped at 3 in the morning because her rig was running on fumes. And the only light for 50 miles was a glowing sign that read, "Last fuel before the Gap locals, only after dark." And she figured that was just small-town humor. So she pulled her 18-wheeler up to the pumps, and a skinny kid in a stained red vest came shuffling out, his face pale and his eyes not quite focusing on her, and he said, "You're not from around here, are you, ma'am?" And she said, "Just passing through, fill her up, diesel," and he nodded slowly and started pumping. But she noticed the numbers on the pump weren't moving. The gallons were ticking down instead of up, going from full to empty, and the kid was humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby played backward. And she went inside to pay, and the store was one of those old-timey places with wooden floors and a pot-belly stove, and shelves stocked with cans that had labels she couldn't read. And behind the counter was a woman so old she looked like a raisin in a floral dress. And the old woman smiled and said, "We don't take money here, sweetheart. We take miles. How many miles you got left on your trip?" And Leticia thought it was a joke. So she laughed and said, "About 300 to my drop-off in Tulsa." And the old woman's smile widened and she reached under the counter and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. Licking her thumb and flipping through pages that were filled with handwritten names, each one crossed out with a single red line. And she found a blank space and wrote Leticia in careful, spidery script and said, 300 miles, that'll cover your fuel and a snack, maybe a soda. You go ahead and pick one." And Leticia felt the floor shift under her feet. It's not physically, but temporally, like the whole store was sliding sideways through time. And she grabbed the counter to steady herself, and her hand landed on a newspaper dated October 17th, 1947. And the headline read, "Gideon's Hollow gas station claims another drifter body found behind pump 3, with empty eyes." And she looked at the old woman, and the old woman's face was now younger, smoother, a woman in her 40s. And she was still writing in the ledger, and she said, "The miles don't just measure distance, honey, they measure life. And you just traded 300 of yours for a tank of diesel. You should feel it any second now." And Leticia felt it, a draining sensation, a cold pull at the base of her skull, and she ran outside and the skinny kid was gone and her rig was gone. The whole parking lot was empty, except for an old rusted truck from the 1940s. And she turned around, and the gas station was a charred ruin, the sign dangling by one chain, the pumps rusted and silent. And she was standing in a field of weeds, with the distant howl of a coyote the only sound. And she walked for hours until she found a state trooper who said, Gideon's Hollow had burned down in 1947 after a gas leak explosion killed the owner and her son. But Leticia still has the receipt from the store in her pocket, a piece of thick yellow paper with her name on it and a number written in red ink. 300, and every time she looks at it, the number is smaller. 247, 189, 112, and she knows that when it hits 0, that ledger will be waiting for her, and the old woman will cross her name out with a red line and offer her a soda for the road that has no end. Wade Hargrove, a 42-year-old freelance journalist from Omaha, Nebraska, is chasing a story about disappearing travelers along a stretch of Highway 83 when he found himself in the town of Mercy Falls, South Dakota. A town that didn't appear on any map but was definitely there. A single long street lined with brick buildings, a 5 and dime. A barber shop with a striped pole that was spinning backward. At the very end of the street, a white clapboard church with a steeple that leaned at a sharp angle, as if it was listening for something. And he parked his car, and the silence was absolute. Not even birdsong, just the creak of the steeple and the whisper of dust devils spinning across the empty road. And he walked to the church because the doors were open and a warm golden light was spilling out onto the steps. And inside the pews were all empty except for one, the very last pew on the left, where a man in a dusty black suit sat with his hands folded and his head bowed, and Wade slid into the pew next to him and said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for information about the missing travelers." And the man raised his head, and his face was a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank canvas that somehow conveyed infinite patience. A voice came from everywhere and nowhere. From the walls, the floor, the high vaulted ceiling, saying, "You were already in the story, Wade. You crossed the town line 47 seconds ago and you haven't blinked since. Because the town absorbs attention, it feeds on the focused mind. And we've been waiting for a journalist, someone who pays close attention to the wrong details." And Wade tried to stand, but his legs were rooted to the floor, and he looked down and saw that the wooden planks under his feet had turned into a gray, clay-like substance that was slowly climbing up his ankles. And the faceless man placed a hand on his shoulder, and the hand was cold and dry, like old paper, and the voice continued, "The church is a recording device. Every prayer ever whispered in Mercy Falls is preserved in the wood grain, every confession, every guilty thought. And now we'll add yours, your deep fear that no one will ever read your work, that you'll die obscure. And that's what the town feeds on, fear of being forgotten." And Wade felt his memories being pulled to the surface like splinters. His first rejection letter, his father's disappointed face, the night he almost gave up writing, and the clay was up to his knees now, and he did the only thing he could think of. He pulled out his notebook and started writing, not a story, but a prayer. A desperate plea scrawled in ballpoint on cheap paper, and he wrote, "I forgive myself. I am not forgotten. I am leaving. I am leaving. I am leaving." And the church shuddered. The steeple groaned. And the faceless man's head tilted in what might have been confusion. And the clay receded, and Wade ran, notebook in hand, down the aisle, out the doors, into the street, where his car was still running. And he drove without looking back until he hit the Nebraska border. And when he finally stopped at a rest area and opened the notebook, his prayer was gone, placed by a single sentence written in elegant copperplate. "You paid attention to the right thing, journalist. You are free, but the next empty pew has your name on it." And all seats fill eventually, and Wade published the story of Mercy Falls under a pseudonym. But he never took another assignment east of the Missouri River, because he knows that somewhere on a long, straight road under a big, empty sky, there's a church steeple listening for the sound of his tires. Savannah Meeks, a 19-year-old photography student from Bloomington, Indiana, was driving through the backroads of central Illinois on a solo road trip to capture the decay of rural America when her old Subaru sputtered and died on a gravel road, surrounded on both sides by towering walls of corn. The stalks so high and thick they seemed to block out the sun. She got out to check the engine, and the silence was oppressive, a thick, muffled quiet like the world was holding its breath. And that's when she heard the whisper, a child's voice coming from deep inside the corn, saying, "Help me, I'm lost. I've been lost for so long," and every instinct told her to stay on the road, to call for help. But her phone had no signal, and the whisper was so plaintive, so scared. And she thought about her little brother back home and couldn't bear the idea of leaving a lost child in that endless green maze. So she stepped into the corn, pushing through the stiff leaves that cut at her arms, and the whisper led her deeper, always just a few rows ahead. And she called out, "I'm coming. Keep talking. I'll find you." And the voice kept moving, and the corn got taller, the stalks thicker, and the ground under her feet turned soft and damp, and she realized she could no longer see the road behind her. No matter which direction she turned, and the whisper changed. The child's voice dropping into something older, deeper, a man's voice that said, "No, you won't find me. I'm not lost. You are." And the corn stalks around her began to bend inward, their tassels drooping, their leaves weaving together into a lattice that blocked out the sky. And she saw figures in the corn, dozens of them, standing perfectly still among the stalks, their bodies made of dried husks and twisted silk, their faces rough approximations of human features, and they were all facing her, and their mouths were open. And from their hollow throats came the same whisper in a chorus of rustling leaves. The corn remembers everything it has ever absorbed, every farmer who died of a heart attack in the rows, every migrant worker who collapsed from heat stroke, every child who wandered in and never came out. And now it remembers you, Savannah. Your name is already growing in the kernels. You're the harvest that's coming due." And she screamed and ran, not in any direction, but just away, crashing through the stalks with the whisper laughter of the corn figures filling her ears. And she burst out of the field, not onto the gravel road, but into a clearing, a perfect circle of bare dirt in the center of the corn. And in the middle of that circle was a scarecrow, a tall, weather-beaten thing with a burlap sack for a head and button eyes that glowed green, and pinned to its chest was a Polaroid photograph. A picture of her standing next to her Subaru, taken from the corn's edge. Picture she didn't remember anyone taking, and on the back of the photo in dark, sap-like letters were the words, "Stay with us," and she heard the corn figures closing in behind her, their husk feet crunching on the soil, and she did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the Polaroid and ran straight at the scarecrow, knocking it over, and where it fell, the corn parted, and she saw her car. And she ran to it, and the engine turned over on the first try, and she drove, not stopping until she hit the interstate. And when she finally calmed down enough to look in the back seat, the Polaroid was there, face up, but the image had changed. And now it showed a cornfield at dusk, with a figure standing in the first row. A figure that looked exactly like her but was wearing her clothes inside out. A folk symbol for someone who has been touched by the other world. And Savannah still has that photograph in a locked box. And every autumn, when the corn is high and the wind blows just right, she hears a child's whisper drifting through her window, asking her to come back and finish the harvest. 5 true accounts from the forgotten roads of America. Places where the welcome signs are written in blood and the locals don't take kindly to strangers passing through. If you ever find yourself in a town that feels a little too quiet, a little too clean, or a little too interested in your arrival, don't stop for gas. Don't accept the free supper. And whatever you do, don't step into the corn. Trust that primal voice in your gut that says you're not supposed to be there. Drive until you see a real town with fast food and traffic lights and people who blink. Now, I want to know, which of these isolated nightmares would you least want to stumble into? Tell me in the comments. And if you never want to miss another wrong turn into terror, hit that like button and subscribe with all notifications on. We've got plenty more stories from the borders of the map, and I promise the next town we visit won't let you leave so icily. Stay safe, stay on the main roads, and never accept a meal from a town with no doors.